The morning the letter arrived, the land was quiet in the way only old land could be. It carried a stillness shaped by decades of routine, of sunrise work and sunset rest, of seasons repeating themselves with quiet certainty. The farmhouse sat at the edge of rolling fields that had once stretched uninterrupted for miles, long before paved roads carved lines through the soil and identical suburban homes rose in neat, controlled rows just beyond the tree line. That land had a memory. It remembered when there were no fences, no regulations, no committees deciding what shade of paint a barn should be. It remembered when the county was little more than dirt paths and scattered farms, when survival depended on hard work and trust rather than paperwork and complaints. The farm had been there through all of it, standing firm while everything around it slowly changed. By the time the Homeowners Association arrived, the farm had already outlived 3 generations of surrounding development. The subdivisions crept closer each year, replacing open fields with trimmed lawns and identical mailboxes. What used to be neighboring farmland became cul-de-sacs with decorative street signs and strict rules about noise, appearances, and property lines. At first, the changes stayed distant enough not to matter. The farm operated as it always had, waking before dawn and working until the light faded. The routines were deeply embedded, almost instinctive. Machinery moved across the fields with purpose. Livestock followed patterns learned over years. The land responded the same way it always had, offering results based on effort and care. But eventually the boundary between old and new blurred. The subdivision expanded again, pushing its borders right up against the far edge of the farm. Where there had once been nothing but trees and open space, there were now rows of houses filled with people unfamiliar with the realities of farm life. They brought expectations shaped by suburban comfort, expectations that clashed immediately with the rhythms of agriculture. It began quietly, a complaint about early morning noise, another about the smell that drifted across the property line, then concerns about machinery operating too late into the evening. Each issue arrived packaged in formal language, stamped with authority that didn't quite belong to the land it tried to control. At first, those complaints were easy to ignore. They came and went without consequence, more of an annoyance than a threat. The farm had legal standing, clear boundaries, and decades of documentation to support its operation. It had been there long before the subdivision existed, long before the HOA had any reason to claim influence over anything beyond its neatly arranged streets. But the complaints didn't stop. They multiplied. Each one grew more detailed, more aggressive, more determined to reshape something that had never asked to be reshaped. At the center of it all was one person. She had moved into the neighborhood recently, arriving with the kind of confidence that came from believing rules were absolute and universally applicable. She saw the world in terms of order and control, where every space should meet a certain standard, where deviations were problems that needed correction. From her perspective, the farm wasn't a legacy. It wasn't history. It wasn't something to be respected. It was a violation. The tractors were too loud. The animals were disruptive. The fences didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. The land itself seemed out of place compared to the polished, uniform environment she expected. Where others might have adjusted, might have accepted the reality that living near a farm meant certain inconveniences, she chose a different path. She documented everything. Photos were taken from every angle, capturing moments meant to support her growing list of complaints. Notes were compiled, detailing times, dates, and perceived violations. Reports were submitted through official HOA channels, each one more forceful than the last. The HOA at first responded cautiously. The situation wasn't straightforward. The farm existed outside their jurisdiction in many ways, protected by zoning laws and long-established rights. But pressure from within the neighborhood began to build, fueled by repeated claims that something needed to be done. The issue slowly shifted from a minor dispute to something more structured. Formal notices began to appear. They were carefully worded, referencing guidelines that didn't fully apply, suggesting compliance with standards that had no authority over the farm. Still, they arrived with an implied weight, as though repetition alone might eventually force a change. The farm didn't respond. Not because it couldn't, but because it didn't need to. There was confidence rooted in something deeper than paperwork. The land itself told a story that no HOA document could overwrite. Ownership wasn't just recorded in files, it was embedded in history, in years of continuous presence, in records that stretched back further than anyone in the subdivision could imagine. But the HOA representative didn't see it that way. To her, silence wasn't confidence, it was defiance. And defiance demanded escalation. The next wave of actions came faster, more aggressive, more calculated. She began reaching beyond the HOA, contacting local offices, filing formal complaints with county departments, attempting to frame the farm's operations as violations of broader regulations. Each attempt was met with the same result. Nothing changed. The farm continued operating as it always had. The land didn't shift to accommodate complaints. The routines didn't bend under pressure. The systems in place were solid, built over years with careful attention to legality and structure. Still, she didn't stop. If anything, the lack of immediate results seemed to push her further. What began as frustration turned into determination. What started as a neighborhood complaint became something closer to a personal mission. She was no longer just reacting to the farm, she was actively trying to dismantle its presence. The shift was subtle but significant. It moved from inconvenience to confrontation. Then one morning the tone changed entirely. A new letter arrived. It wasn't from the HOA. The envelope was different, heavier, official in a way that carried a distinct kind of authority. The markings were unmistakable, signaling a level of involvement far beyond local disputes or neighborhood disagreements. For a moment, the quiet of the farm felt different. The fields stretched out as they always had, the same patterns of life continuing uninterrupted, but something about the atmosphere shifted. The letter introduced a new variable, something external, something unexpected. It suggested that the situation had moved beyond what it should have ever become. Inside, the language was formal, precise, and serious. It referenced an investigation. It mentioned federal oversight. It implied that certain concerns had been raised that warranted attention at a level far above county lines. There was no confusion about what had happened. Somehow, the situation had escalated to involve the highest level of enforcement available. And there was only one person who would have pushed it that far. The realization settled in slowly. What had once been a simple conflict over noise and property boundaries had now transformed into something much larger. It had crossed a line that most people wouldn't even consider approaching. But she had. Driven by certainty, by a belief that she was enforcing order, she had reached beyond every reasonable boundary, pulling in forces that operated on an entirely different scale. The farm stood unchanged. The land didn't react, the routines didn't falter, but beneath the surface, something had shifted. Because while the letter represented escalation, it also represented exposure. And exposure had a way of revealing things that had long remained unnoticed. The kind of things that didn't just resolve conflicts, but ended them. As the day moved forward and the weight of the letter settled into place, one thing became clear. This situation was no longer about complaints. It was about consequences. And the next move would change everything. The arrival of federal attention didn't disrupt the farm in any visible way, at least not at first. The fields still moved with the same rhythm, machinery followed its familiar routes, and the land continued to respond to the routines it had known for decades. But beneath that steady surface, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be ignored. The letter was no longer just paper. It represented escalation at a level that rarely happened without significant reason. Federal involvement meant someone had taken the situation far beyond local disagreements, far beyond neighborhood authority, and placed it into a system that operated with far greater reach and consequence. The timing of everything began to align. The complaints, the documentation, the persistence of one individual who refused to let the issue rest, it all pointed in one direction. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a miscommunication, it was deliberate. And it had consequences that the person responsible clearly hadn't anticipated. By the next morning, the quiet roads leading toward the farm saw something unusual. Vehicles that didn't belong to the area moved with purpose, cutting through the familiar landscape without hesitation. They weren't the kind of vehicles that stopped for directions or slowed to take in the view. They arrived with intent, carrying the weight of official presence. When they reached the property, there was no chaos, no dramatic disruption. Instead, there was structure, precision, a kind of calm authority that came from people who operated within clear systems and procedures. The farm, in response, remained exactly what it had always been, unmoved. There was no scrambling, no visible concern, no sense of panic. The buildings stood where they always had, the land stretched out without interruption. The operation continued as though nothing had changed. That contrast was striking. On one side, a system designed to investigate, to question, to examine every detail with scrutiny. On the other, a place that had already been built to withstand scrutiny long before this moment ever arrived. Because the truth was, the farm had never operated casually. Every inch of the property had been documented, not just recently, but across decades. Records existed that traced ownership back through generations, establishing a timeline that predated most of the structures surrounding it. Permits, environmental assessments, water usage rights, land classifications, everything had been secured, updated, and preserved with a level of attention that most people would never consider necessary. That preparation wasn't accidental. It came from experience. The land had seen challenges before, different forms of pressure, different kinds of disputes, all handled in ways that ensured the farm remained exactly what it was meant to be. So when federal agents stepped onto the property, they weren't walking into uncertainty. They were stepping into a place that already had answers waiting. The process began methodically. Observations were made, documents were reviewed, questions were asked, not out of suspicion alone, but out of obligation to follow procedure. Each step followed a structure that had been repeated countless times in different situations. But something quickly became apparent. There was no chaos to uncover, no hidden violations waiting to be exposed, no shortcuts, no oversights, no negligence. Every element of the farm's operation aligned with regulations, not just at a local level, but at state and federal levels as well. Environmental protections were in place. Water sources were properly managed and legally secured. Agricultural activities followed established guidelines that had been met consistently over time. Instead of discovering problems, the investigation revealed something else entirely: stability, consistency, and a history that extended far deeper than expected. As records were examined more closely, a pattern emerged. The farm wasn't just old, it was foundational. Its presence wasn't a recent development or an isolated operation. It had played a role in shaping the area itself, contributing to the structure of the county long before subdivisions and associations began defining modern boundaries. That history wasn't something that could be overlooked. It carried weight, and it began to shift the perspective of the situation. At the same time, attention started to move in another direction. Because investigations don't only focus on the subject, they also examine the source. The complaint that triggered federal involvement didn't exist in isolation. It had an origin, a chain of actions that led from a single concern to a formal escalation at the highest level. And that chain was now under scrutiny. The pattern of complaints began to matter. Their frequency, their content, the way they had been documented and submitted, it all painted a picture. What initially appeared as concern started to look more like persistence without justification. Each report had pushed the situation further, building toward an escalation that now seemed increasingly disproportionate to the reality on the ground. The shift was subtle at first, but it was undeniable. What had been presented as a problem was starting to look like something else entirely: overreach. Meanwhile, the subdivision remained unaware of how quickly the situation was evolving. From a distance, everything appeared to be unfolding exactly as expected. Federal agents had arrived. The farm was under investigation. The assumption was simple: the system would confirm what had been claimed, and action would follow. That assumption didn't account for what the investigation was actually revealing, because while attention had been drawn to the farm, it was now expanding outward, tracing the origins of the complaint with the same level of detail. And the more it traced, the clearer things became. The HOA's involvement wasn't as straightforward as it had seemed. Documentation showed a pattern of pressure applied in ways that extended beyond its authority. Notices had been issued that referenced guidelines without jurisdiction. Complaints had been framed in ways that amplified minor issues into something more serious. Individually, those actions might not have raised concerns, but together they formed a narrative, one that suggested intent rather than necessity. As that narrative developed, the balance of the situation began to shift. The farm was no longer at the center of the problem. It was becoming the reference point that exposed it. By the time the second day of the investigation began, the tone had changed. The questions being asked were different. The focus had broadened. What started as an inquiry into agricultural practices had evolved into something that examined the entire chain of events that led to federal involvement. And that chain led directly back to the HOA. More specifically, it led to the individual who had driven the process forward. Her actions, once seen as assertive, were now being viewed through a different lens. The documentation she had carefully compiled was being re-examined, not as evidence of violations, but as part of a larger pattern that suggested escalation without proper cause. The confidence that fueled her actions hadn't prepared her for this, because she believed in authority, but she misunderstood how it worked. Authority didn't exist to enforce personal standards. It operated within defined limits, guided by facts rather than assumptions. And when those limits were crossed, the consequences didn't fall where she expected them to. They reversed direction. By the third day, the presence of federal agents was no longer the most significant development. The real shift was happening in the understanding of the situation. The farm had been tested and found to be exactly what it claimed to be: stable, compliant, and deeply rooted in both law and history. The complaints that triggered the investigation, however, were revealing something far more complicated and far more serious. Because once a system like this begins to uncover inconsistencies, it doesn't stop at the surface. It continues deeper. And the deeper it goes, the harder it becomes to control the outcome. Back in the subdivision, the quiet confidence that once defined the situation began to fade, though no one could fully explain why. There was no official announcement, no clear indication of what was happening beyond the visible presence of federal vehicles coming and going. But something in the atmosphere had changed. The certainty was gone, replaced by uncertainty, and uncertainty had a way of spreading. As the investigation moved forward, one fact became increasingly clear. This was no longer about a farm being investigated. It was about a system being examined. And systems, when pushed too far, had a tendency to reveal everything hidden within them. The kind of revelations that didn't just resolve disputes, but redefined them entirely. The next phase was approaching, and it would bring answers that couldn't be ignored. Answers that would shift the entire narrative. And once those answers came to light, there would be no going back. By the time the third phase of the investigation unfolded, the story had already begun to change shape in ways no one in the subdivision had anticipated. What started as a confident push to impose order on a piece of land that didn't conform had quietly transformed into something far more complex, something that now carried consequences beyond a single complaint. The farm itself remained steady, almost unaffected on the surface. The fields continued to stretch under the same sky, the machinery followed its routine paths, and the structures stood with the same quiet endurance they always had. To an outside observer, nothing appeared different. But beneath that stillness, the weight of what was being uncovered had begun to settle into place. Because the investigation had moved past verification. It had entered analysis, and analysis, when applied thoroughly, had a way of exposing not just facts, but intentions. The documentation gathered over the previous days had created a clear foundation. The farm's compliance with regulations was no longer a question. It had been confirmed, reinforced, and supported by records that left no room for doubt. Every permit, every environmental safeguard, every operational detail aligned with standards that extended far beyond what the HOA could ever influence. That part of the story was complete. What remained unfinished was the reason the investigation had been initiated in the first place: the complaints. At first, they had been treated as credible concerns, structured reports that followed a certain format, submitted through channels that suggested legitimacy. But once the farm itself had been cleared of any wrongdoing, those same reports took on a different significance. They became evidence, not of violations on the farm, but of something else entirely, a pattern. As analysts began to examine the complaints more closely, they noticed how consistent they were, not in substance, but in tone. Each report carried the same underlying message, the same attempt to frame ordinary farm activity as something disruptive, excessive, or non-compliant. The language shifted slightly from one submission to the next, but the intent remained constant. It wasn't about solving a problem. It was about creating one. The timeline added another layer to that realization. The complaints didn't emerge randomly. They followed a progression. They started small, then escalated in both frequency and severity. Each new submission built upon the last, amplifying the situation until it reached a point where federal attention was triggered. That kind of escalation didn't happen by accident. It required persistence and direction. All of it led back to a single source. Her involvement was no longer just assumed, it was documented. Every complaint, every report, every attempt to involve higher authorities carried her influence in some form. The evidence she had collected, the arguments she had constructed, the pressure she had applied, it all pointed in one direction. But what she saw as a strong case was beginning to unravel under scrutiny. Because the investigation didn't rely on interpretation, it relied on verification. And verification was exposing inconsistencies. Photos that were presented as evidence of violations were being re-examined with context that hadn't been included, moments captured out of sequence, angles that misrepresented distances, situations framed in ways that didn't reflect reality when viewed in full. Reports that described disruptions were being compared against operational logs that showed routine activity within legal limits. Claims of environmental concerns were cross-checked with inspections that had already cleared the farm repeatedly over the years. One by one, the pieces that had been used to build the case began to lose their weight. And as they did, something else began to take their place. A different kind of narrative. One that suggested the complaints weren't just exaggerated, but constructed. The distinction mattered, because exaggeration could be dismissed as misunderstanding. Construction implied intent. And intent carried consequences. At the same time, attention turned toward the HOA itself. Its role in the situation had initially been seen as secondary, a platform through which complaints were submitted, a structure that processed concerns from its members. But as the investigation deepened, it became clear that the HOA hadn't simply passed along information. It had participated, not necessarily through direct action, but through allowance. The notices it issued, the way it responded to repeated complaints, the language it used when addressing the farm, it all contributed to the escalation. Instead of maintaining a neutral position, it had gradually aligned itself with a narrative that was now being questioned. That alignment was subtle but significant, because it suggested that the HOA had stepped beyond its boundaries, not just geographically, but procedurally. It had treated the farm as though it fell within its jurisdiction. It didn't. That realization shifted the focus even further. The investigation was no longer confined to determining whether the farm had violated any rules. It was now examining whether the rules themselves had been misapplied or deliberately used in ways they weren't intended to be used. By the fourth day, the presence of federal agents had become less about observation and more about resolution. The groundwork had been laid. The facts had been established. What remained was determining how those facts would be interpreted within the framework of law and authority. And that framework was becoming increasingly clear. The farm was not the issue. It never had been. It was the trigger, the point around which everything else had been constructed. But once that point was tested and found to be solid, everything built against it began to collapse under its own weight. Meanwhile, within the subdivision, the atmosphere had changed in ways that were harder to ignore. The initial confidence that had surrounded the situation had been replaced by a quiet tension. There were no official statements, no clear updates, but the absence of expected outcomes spoke loudly. Nothing had happened to the farm. No shutdowns, no penalties, no visible consequences. Instead, the activity seemed to be moving in the opposite direction, towards something that wasn't entirely understood, but was clearly not aligning with the original expectations. That uncertainty created space for doubt, and doubt, once introduced, spread quickly. The individual at the center of it all remained convinced that the process would eventually validate her actions. The belief in structure, in authority, in the idea that systems existed to enforce standards, those beliefs didn't disappear easily. But what she hadn't accounted for was how those systems actually functioned when examined from the inside. They didn't operate on assumptions. They operated on facts. And facts were no longer supporting her position. The final shift came quietly. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden confrontation. Instead, there was a gradual redirection of focus, a movement away from the farm and toward the origins of the investigation itself. The same systems that had been called upon to enforce order were now evaluating whether that call had been justified. And in doing so, they were uncovering something far more significant than any complaint about noise or property lines. They were uncovering misuse of process, of authority, of escalation. That realization didn't just change the outcome, it changed the entire context of the situation. Because once misuse is identified, the question is no longer whether action should be taken. It becomes what kind of action is necessary to correct it. As the investigation reached its most critical stage, one thing became certain. The consequences that were coming would not fall where they were originally intended. They would move in the opposite direction. And when they did, the impact would extend beyond a single individual, beyond a single complaint, beyond even the HOA itself. It would redefine the boundaries of what could and could not be done. The system had been pushed. Now it was pushing back, and the response would be impossible to ignore. The fourth day of the unfolding drama marked a turning point that no one in the neighborhood had anticipated. By now, the federal investigation had shifted from simple verification to a careful analysis of intent and procedural integrity. The farm, which had remained completely compliant throughout the escalation, had already established its innocence. Every permit, every record, every operational detail reinforced the undeniable fact that it had done nothing wrong. Yet the real story was no longer about compliance. It was about accountability. The system that had been called in to examine the farm's operations now turned its attention fully toward those who had initiated the escalation. Each report, each complaint, each attempt to pressure local authorities was under scrutiny. The federal agents, meticulous in their approach, were tracing the path of the complaints like threads in a web, connecting the dots between repeated reports, HOA notices, and the pattern of persistent escalation. Every detail mattered, from the timestamps of emails to the language used in formal notices. As the agents dug deeper, the situation became increasingly revealing. The very documentation that had been intended to bolster the case against the farm now served as evidence of an orchestrated campaign. The complaints, when viewed as a collective, painted a picture of deliberate overreach, not legitimate concern. The frequency of submissions, the escalation in tone, and the consistent targeting of routine farm operations all pointed toward a single conclusion. Someone had abused the system for personal satisfaction, wielding authority without understanding its true limits. At the same time, the farm remained untouched by the tension around it. Its presence was steady and unyielding, as if the land itself recognized the truth that human actors had overlooked. Tractors continued their paths through fields of corn and wheat. Livestock grazed peacefully in enclosures built decades ago, and every boundary of the property remained intact, unquestionable in its legitimacy. It was a physical testament to the legacy and diligence of the family that had maintained the land since 1987. The farm's stability contrasted sharply with the growing unraveling of the HOA's credibility, highlighting the depth of the miscalculation by the individual who had initiated the complaints. The unfolding examination didn't just focus on the legitimacy of the complaints. It also considered the broader context of authority and responsibility. The HOA had functioned as an enabler, processing and amplifying complaints without verifying their basis. Its actions, while seemingly routine within its limited jurisdiction, were now being viewed under the lens of procedural propriety. Notices sent without authority, the framing of minor disruptions as violations, and the persistent reinforcement of baseless claims all indicated negligence and a lack of accountability. As the federal agents pieced together the evidence, the true scale of the overreach became clear. The complaints that had triggered the investigation were not isolated incidents. They formed a carefully constructed sequence, escalating tension over time, pushing the narrative in a single direction toward the farm. The meticulous attention to detail by the individual responsible had been designed to manipulate perception, but it had left behind a trail of unmistakable patterns that revealed intent far beyond casual concern. By now, the implications were evident. The farm had not only been vindicated, but the narrative had flipped entirely. The escalation that had begun as a challenge to one family's property had inadvertently exposed weaknesses in the HOA's processes and demonstrated the consequences of personal vendettas masquerading as concern for community standards. The balance of power had shifted quietly but decisively. The agent's review of legal documents and property records also highlighted the family's deep-rooted presence in the county. Decades of ownership, contributions to local governance, and a history of community engagement all reinforced the legitimacy of the farm's operations. What might have seemed like ordinary property boundaries took on a broader significance when contextualized against this historical backdrop. The farm was not just a piece of land, it was a legacy, a foundational element of the county itself. With each layer of investigation, the original instigator's miscalculation became more apparent. She had operated under the assumption that authority could be wielded to impose personal standards, that persistence alone would yield compliance. She had failed to recognize the structural safeguards in place and the strength of the historical and legal record protecting the farm. Her campaign of complaints had not only failed to achieve its goal, it had created a situation in which her actions were now being scrutinized for legitimacy and intent. As the agents continued their methodical review, attention turned to the broader HOA leadership. While the individual who had initiated the escalation was at the center, the HOA itself was not exempt from examination. Its policies, the way it handled complaints, and its role in reinforcing escalation were all under review. The same system that had initially been called upon to enforce standards was now examining whether those standards had been misapplied and whether procedural norms had been ignored in favor of personal agendas. The landscape of authority was shifting. The farm, once the subject of scrutiny, had become a touchstone of compliance and legitimacy. The instigator's position, once bolstered by a perceived alignment with community norms and HOA authority, was now eroding under the weight of facts. Her confidence in controlling the situation was no longer relevant. The structures she had tried to manipulate were functioning as designed, exposing overreach and misjudgment. By midweek, the implications had begun to ripple beyond the property itself. Neighbors who had initially supported the complaints, or had at least remained neutral, were starting to sense the change. The lack of action against the farm, coupled with subtle indications of procedural missteps on the HOA's part, created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Whispers and questions began to circulate. What had gone wrong? Who had misrepresented facts? And how would accountability be assigned? The transformation was not immediate, but it was undeniable. The narrative had shifted from farm under investigation to complaints under scrutiny. The power dynamics that had seemed fixed were now fluid. The legacy of the farm, the thoroughness of its compliance, and the integrity of its historical record had become the basis of authority, replacing assumptions and overreach with documented truth. By the time the fourth day ended, the situation had reached a critical juncture. The federal agents had compiled extensive evidence, confirming the farm's compliance and establishing a clear pattern of escalation by the HOA instigator. The process that had begun as an inquiry into alleged violations had now become a formal examination of the origin of those complaints and the misuse of authority in the escalation process. The farm, calm and undisturbed, awaited the conclusion. Its fields remained untouched, its legacy intact. The land had weathered countless storms, but this one carried a different significance. It was not only a test of compliance, it was a test of resilience, of history, and of the structures that had protected it for decades. And while the instigator had acted with confidence and certainty, she had underestimated the depth of that protection. The unfolding events had begun to reveal a truth she had never considered, that authority is not absolute, and that systems built on facts, history, and law ultimately prevail over ambition and overreach. As night fell over the farm on the fourth day, a quiet sense of inevitability settled in. The situation was no longer a question of investigation. It was now a question of consequence. The narrative had shifted, the evidence was clear, and the balance of power had begun to tip decisively. What came next would not be about complaints, accusations, or minor disputes. It would be about accountability, exposure, and the restoration of order in a system that had briefly been manipulated for personal ends. The farm, as it always had, remained a steady witness to the unfolding events, a constant amid chaos, and a reminder that history and legitimacy could withstand even the most determined challenges. The following morning brought an unusual stillness to the subdivision. The usual hum of lawn mowers, the faint chatter of neighbors, even the distant sound of children playing seemed muted, as though the neighborhood itself sensed the shift in power that had quietly taken place. For weeks, the HOA had operated under the assumption that it held authority over the farm, that complaints, notices, and escalation could bend decades of land history to their will. That assumption had now been proven false. Inside the Federal Investigation Office, agents methodically compiled the final pieces of their report. Every complaint, every notice, every documented email and photo had been scrutinized. The farm's compliance with all local, state, and federal regulations had been verified. No environmental violations, no zoning infractions, no procedural missteps on the farm's part had been found. The land, the operation, the family's legacy, it all stood beyond reproach. But the most significant discovery wasn't about the farm itself. It was about the origin of the escalation. The evidence clearly indicated that the complaints had been exaggerated, manipulated, and submitted with intent to coerce a resolution that favored one individual's personal perspective. The HOA, while not malicious in its own actions, had facilitated that escalation without verifying the legitimacy of the claims, further compounding the issue. The narrative had completely flipped. What began as a fight to control a farm's operations had now become an examination of overreach, misuse of authority, and reckless escalation. The instigator's carefully documented campaign to provoke action against the farm now exposed her own lack of understanding of authority and process. Her confidence, once unshakable, had eroded under the weight of meticulous scrutiny. The federal report concluded with a series of clear recommendations. The farm should remain untouched, its operational autonomy reaffirmed, and the HOA required to review its internal complaint procedures to prevent future overreach. Additionally, the instigator's actions were formally noted as examples of improper escalation that could have serious legal implications if repeated. In essence, she had unintentionally drawn attention not to the farm, but to herself. Back on the farm, life continued as usual. The machinery moved across fields with practiced precision. Animals grazed contentedly, their patterns unchanged. The land had endured as it always had, unaffected by the misguided attempts to disrupt it. But now, the history embedded in the property and the family's careful stewardship had gained an unexpected power. The power to correct a narrative, to restore balance, and to remind others that authority has limits. Word of the investigation's outcome spread quickly through the neighborhood, though not officially at first. Whispers and rumors circulated, neighbors speculating about the events, the involvement of federal authorities, and the unexpected vindication of the farm. Those who had initially supported the complaints began to reconsider their positions, some quietly, some openly. Confidence in the HOA's ability to manage disputes waned as the truth became clear. The system had acted as intended, and the farm had emerged unscathed. The instigator, facing the reality of her misjudgment, found herself isolated. Her attempts to assert authority had not only failed, but had revealed a pattern of overreach that now reflected poorly on her judgment. The letters, emails, and formal complaints she had compiled so meticulously had become the very evidence of her miscalculation. Her ambition to control had been transformed into a cautionary tale about the limits of authority and the importance of understanding context, history, and legality. Meanwhile, the farm's legacy was reinforced. Decades of dedication, careful record-keeping, and unwavering adherence to law and procedure now carried additional weight. The family's name, associated with land stewardship since 1987, had been vindicated in a dramatic way, demonstrating the resilience and enduring power of preparation, history, and legitimacy. The final resolution extended beyond the immediate parties. The HOA underwent an internal review, implementing stricter guidelines for complaint management, documentation, and escalation. Policies were adjusted to prevent individuals from leveraging personal authority to create disputes that could escalate unnecessarily. Lessons were learned, not through argument or negotiation, but through the undeniable clarity of investigation and evidence. On the farm, the land remained a constant witness to history and truth. Seasons continued their cycle, and life unfolded with the familiar rhythm that had sustained the property for decades. The challenges of human ambition, overreach, and miscalculation had passed, leaving behind a restored sense of order and reaffirmed legitimacy. In the end, the situation served as a stark reminder to the neighborhood. Authority has limits, systems function as intended when based on facts and history, and attempts to manipulate process for personal gain carry consequences far beyond expectation. The farm had not only survived, it had exposed flaws, corrected narratives, and restored balance in a way that few could have anticipated. The instigator's misjudgment became a story that quietly circulated among neighbors, a lesson in humility, oversight, and the dangers of overstepping boundaries. Meanwhile, the farm continued its work, unaffected in routine, yet reinforced in authority and legacy, a testament to resilience and the enduring power of preparation. By the time the week had ended, the federal agents departed, their work complete. The letters, the inspections, the thorough reviews, they had confirmed what the land had always known: compliance, history, and integrity prevail. And as the farmhouse settled into another evening, with the fields stretching wide under the fading sun, the family could finally breathe easy. Their legacy, cultivated over decades, had been tested in a way they had never imagined, and it had emerged stronger than ever. The HOA, the instigator, and the surrounding community had learned a lesson in accountability, authority, and the limits of control. The farm remained steady and unshaken, a living reminder that respect for history, adherence to the law, and patience in the face of unwarranted pressure could withstand even the most audacious challenges. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.